Hello, everybody. I'm back, as I'm always going to be. And today I actually stumbled across this video here. Here, let me start recording my lovely screen so that y'all can see what I see. Don't mind it might be horrible. I don't know. I still don't have a camera yet to replace the one that I broke. But I found this video called Japan. Oh, screen recorder is not working. 1 second. So I found this video called Japan's Unconventional Solution to the Housing Crisis. I started watching it. I'm only about like a minute in, but we are going to start from the beginning because I'd love to talk about it. And for those who are unaware, Japan is very, very cheap in comparison to the United States to live in. And I guess there's a housing crisis everywhere, except Japan, of course. But like at the same time, there's probably reasons to that, which we'll find out in this video as soon as this decides to record. Hello? All right, there we go. Okay, so without further ado, let's get into the video.
Housing crisis, a term that today defines life in almost any major city. From America to Europe and Asia, owning or even renting a property is becoming unaffordable even for the middle class, and no one seems to be able to do anything about it. But that's not the case here, in the world's largest urban area, housing almost 40 million people, in Tokyo. Even though the city itself is bigger than New York, and its population is growing just as quickly, somehow Tokyo manages to avoid a crippling housing crisis. And compared to any other peer city, including London, Singapore, or even Shanghai, rent and property prices in Tokyo are incredibly cheap. So much that Tokyo has been called the world's last big city with affordable housing. And that's not a coincidence, but a result of a unique Japanese approach to urban.
Alright, so maybe in comparison to the rest of the world, but for Japanese standards, Tokyo is about one of the most expensive cities in the country to live in. But let's keep going.
Planning that's completely different than in any other country. So how does Tokyo manage to stay so big and so affordable at the same time? And why aren't we doing the same thing everywhere? This is how Tokyo solved housing. But first, let's establish how cheap Tokyo actually is, because it's not a minor difference. According to Loughborough University Global City Ranking, these are the 9 most economically important cities in the world, and compared to every single one of them, Tokyo is by far the most affordable, both in terms of property prices and cost of rent. Tokyo is much cheaper than London or New York, but it's also cheaper than Shanghai and Beijing, even though average wages in both of the Chinese cities are much lower than in Tokyo. And it's cheaper than Singapore, even though Singapore has been praised for its affordable housing. In other words, compared to any other global city, Tokyo is dirt cheap. And while you might be thinking that this would be explained by Japan's population crisis, that's not actually true. While the Japanese population has slightly decreased in the past 20 years, the size of Tokyo City, which makes up about 1/3 of the entire urban area, has been going up. And in the last 2 decades, it added just as many people as London or New York. So how does Tokyo stay so cheap? Well, the answer is both simple and complex at the same time. The way Tokyo remains affordable is by simply building a lot more housing than other cities, which might not seem that revolutionary. After all, it's what politicians in basically every Western country have been promising to do for decades. But the thing is that despite these promises, most major cities are completely failing in actually doing that. And unlike them, Tokyo has been able to actually do what everyone else is just talking about, thanks to the unique way of how Japanese cities are designed. So how do they do it? Well, there are 3 things that make Japanese urban planning different from almost anywhere else on the planet. First, Japan holds a first place in 2 specific categories. It has the highest inheritance tax in the world.
If I had to guess, it's the lack of space, right? In here in the United States, like even my room, for instance, in my house, it's fucking huge. Like, I can't throw if I had to guesstimate, for starters, I got 20-foot cathedral ceilings, completely unnecessary. I I don't know how long my room is, or I only just moved here. I didn't take any measurements of anything, but like my room is bigger than my last room here, and it doesn't need to be whatsoever. So like they have a high balance between like needed space versus unnecessary space. Like, granted, it is nice to have extra space and stuff, but where they do find extra space, they make use of it in better ways rather than it just being empty space. You know what I'm saying? Let's keep going.
world, and it has more earthquakes than any other country. And as a result, it has a unique approach to urban planning and architecture. Because houses in Japan have a higher risk of being damaged by earthquakes, and because in order to pass down a house to your kids, they would have to pay a 50% of its value in inheritance tax, real estate in Japan is seen very differently than anywhere else. Rather than being an asset that will always appreciate in value over time and that you build to last as long as possible, in Japan, real estate is more like consumer goods. Just like you wouldn't expect a fridge to last forever,
Alright, I'm sorry I keep pausing, by the way, but that's something I didn't really take into account either. Granted, the city I'm gonna be living in is over an hour away by Shinkansen from Tokyo itself. It's like in the Japanese Alps, so it's surrounded by mountains. The earthquakes out there aren't as bad as they are in Tokyo. So yeah, I didn't really think about that, but that makes a lot of sense. As well as the fact that, like, for some reason, houses out here, it's just on a steady, sharp fucking incline upwards. Like, houses way back in the 20s, the same house, now a decade later, not a decade, now a century later, are worth like triple, quadruple, quintuple the price they were worth back then. For essentially no reason. People will blame it on inflation, but really there's no fucking reason that the market price of these houses just keeps going up and up and up and up and up. But that's what's happening.
houses in Japan are not built to last, and people don't want to live in pre-owned buildings. And so most houses have a pretty short lifespan of about 30 years, after which they are usually demolished, and something else is built in their place. But now, let me take a quick pause to talk about a sponsor of this video, Masterworks. As Japan, where the stock and housing market have been flat for decades, shows really well, no investment has a guaranteed result. And that's why it makes sense for
Sorry, but we're skipping your ad.
In Tokyo, only 1% of houses are older than 1951, and the housing market is in a constant process of tearing down old buildings and building new ones, which means that the housing market is much more flexible and adapts much better to the current demand. Every neighborhood is constantly.
Alright, so that kind of sucks, because it's like, oh, I don't have a family home, a childhood home where me, my grandparents, my parents all grew up and stuff like that. But at the same time, that's kind of a good thing, you know, because like these houses whose value keeps skyrocketing are still deprecating, like physically deprecating. They're not as reliable to live in, they don't have as good insulation and stuff like that. So, like, I personally have no complaints with every 30 years your family gotta up and leave to somewhere new. Not just new in a sense that you're moving out and moving in there, but new as in a new property as well, like a newly built property. So, it's just the different standards from the west to the east. Kind of, that's what I'm thinking make all the difference really here, but hey, welcome to the West.
changing. And if there is a now bigger demand for housing than there used to be, you can just easily tear down a few one-story houses and build something a lot bigger instead. And then maybe downsize once again if the demand goes down. But this wouldn't be really possible anywhere else, which takes us to the second factor, regulation, or actually the lack of it. In America or Europe, when a developer wants to build any kind of residential property, there are hundreds of rules that regulate everything from number of parking spaces, maximum density, height, percentage of green spaces, and much more. Complying with all of them means that building anything is really expensive, and it's almost impossible to build any kind of dense housing, meaning that free space is used in a very inefficient way. On top of that, zoning regulations usually
Yeah, that's what I said earlier, is that like all the free space is used very inefficiently. And in Japan, they find use for that space. Like, oh, there's this big strip. They also have green. Don't get it confused. They have green spaces as well. But yeah, the regulations and such are a lot more lax over in Japan, which is like, that's like the, what is it? Tokyo capsule. This building no longer exists. Yes, Nakagen Capsule Tower, right? So this building no longer exists, but like it was a grand idea, and how it would have worked is, say if any of these little pods here, all of these were like separate pods connected on a central structure. So if any of the pods needed to be repaired, they could easily just remove, well, not easily, and that's part of the problem with it and why it ended up getting demolished. But like essentially what they were going for is that you could remove the pod, like, so like that's where it was bad, because say this pod had an issue, they would have to remove one, two, three, four, five other pods above it in order to remove, they would just like pull them out the top in order to remove that one that had an issue. But which is something they don't even think about doing in the West. But like, just even the thought behind this building would be a complete no-go in the Western world. And like, there is, don't be confused, there is crazy structures in the West, but usually they're more for the artistic appeal for them, and not really for the like actual, what would you call it, like infrastructure's future appeal for them. You know, they kind of make like passion projects and stuff that like look good for the eyes, but they don't really think about degradation of the building and stuff like that. So let's continue.
strict what kind of housing can be built in one area, and often only allow one specific type, for example single-family homes, which leads to the existence of massive suburbs with no services. But in Tokyo, you don't really have any of those restrictions. Japanese zoning laws encourage mixed-use zones, meaning that you can have different kinds of housing in one neighborhood, and buildings of different shapes, heights, and sizes right next to each other, something that would be never allowed in most places across America or Europe. And there's basically no regulation for how dense these neighborhoods should be, how much parking they need, or what these buildings should look like, which is why in Tokyo you have so many houses that look like this. And as a result, Japanese zoning is able to use space a lot more efficiently and build a lot of housing in relatively small areas. And finally, unlike in much of the developed world, Tokyo and the majority of cities in Japan don't really have NIMBYs, people who actively oppose any development in their local area and push for the strictest possible housing regulations.
Okay, that is the other thing that I didn't even really think about. Like I did mention families like not wanting to move and having that, you know, family house and stuff. But yeah, NIMBY. That's a that's a funny word for it. But yeah, it's absolutely true. All the time, if anything happens, it's not even in their backyard per se, but like, oh, they have to fix the pipes out front, for instance, and renovate and add new water lines. Somebody somewhere along the road will come out like, oh, I've been living here for X amount of years, insert couple decades, and I've never had an issue, blah, 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 this or that. Why you guys need to do this? Find somewhere else to do this. Like, go bring that to the inner city or something, not here in the suburbs, this and that. And yeah, people are very like passionate about their personal space. And it's not that you don't have personal space in Japan. Like, yeah, the houses are cramped and stuff like that, but there's a real strong sense of community, as well as they understand that things need to change. And like, you make use of the space you got around you, you make it your own, it becomes your personal space, you know. So just my take on it.
Relations. And it's not just because of the different mentality. The real reason why Japan doesn't have this phenomenon is because NIMBYism is, well, not allowed. Or to be precise, in most of the world, it's the local governments that decide what gets built and where. Because the job of these local governments is to protect the interests of local residents, they are often motivated to block any new development in their area that the locals are usually not happy about. But because that happens in every neighborhood, the end result is that you can't actually build anything anywhere. But in Japan, this is decided on a centralized national level, and regional governments and local citizens don't really get any say in that matter. In that way, the decisions are made by people who are supposed to have the bigger picture in mind, and who are tasked with providing enough housing for everyone, rather than protecting the particular interests of people in one area. And as a result, they are a lot more development friendly, and more housing gets built. And in that way, Japan effectively bypasses the NIMBY problem. Now, of course, there are downsides. With higher density, you don't get a lot of green spaces, and Tokyo has much less of them than most big cities. People have to put up with constant development, and they can't really influence what gets built in their neighborhood. But the bottom line is that by building so much, Tokyo is one of the few major cities in the world that manages to remain affordable for everyone. And it demonstrates that housing crises are not inevitable, and that we can solve them by just building more. But then, why aren't cities all over the world taking an example from Tokyo? Well, some of the things are probably not possible to reapply anywhere else. It's unlikely that Europe would start demolishing all the historic buildings and replacing them with new development. But many methods used in Japan that would enable building more housing, thereby making it more affordable for everyone, could be very well used almost anywhere else. And so it's not that we couldn't use the methods, it's that in most of the developed world, for some reason we don't want to. And while it's hard to say why, my guess would be that it's because our relationship to real estate is completely different. In Japan, your house is a temporary product that's probably not going to be worth much in 30 years' time. But in most of the world, your home is your most valuable asset. The difference between being lower or middle class, your retirement policy, and the sign that you made it, that we have all been sold. That's why people who already have a property.
Hello, future and editing Cecilio here, and I realized that I didn't have much constructive criticism to say. Well, it's not constructive criticism. They, one, probably aren't going to see this video, and two, I don't really have any other way that like I'd be like, oh, you should have done this and that. But like, I didn't really have much of a take at the end of the video due to technical difficulties. But I did just want to say that was great, you know, like, and jeez, what the heck is stuck in my throat? Anyway, yeah, that was great. And yeah, it is really unconventional the way they do things. Unconventional, I guess you could say. To them, it's normal, but from our perspective, it is definitely an unconventional way to do things out there. However, yeah, if more places took on that role and did things the way they did out there, it might not be so much of a problem everywhere else, but it is a big problem everywhere. And and they're not doing anything about it. So, like, why they don't do anything about it is beyond me. I am just one of those people that have been sold this visions of grandeur that they mentioned towards the end of the video there. Like the status of wealth, showing that you made it, making the home your own, all this and that, and blah, blah, blah. But life is fleeting, life is futile. So, like, after you're gone, all that stuff doesn't really matter anymore, you know? So, like, live in the moment now and enjoy the things that you do have. Because you're not going to be there after you're gone to stop them from changing it. So, like, build a legacy with your children, build a legacy with your family, start a business or something. Like, do something like that to carry on your line, not own a house for the past 50 years that is taking up space and not being renovated because the people refuse to let it be renovated, all those NIMBYs and stuff, you know? And yeah, and enjoy it. Enjoy it while it's there, because once you're gone, you're gone. So, anyway, I just wanted to add like an actual take to the end of the video because it was a pretty abrupt cut there. But all right, y'all. If you made it to the end, thank you all so much for watching. I've got a lot of work ahead of me, and I will see you guys in the next one. Johnny.